All right, hello and welcome to this episode where we're going to talk about the problem with living with OCD and anxiety. So, again, my name is Matt Codde and welcome to the show. And so, on this episode, really, this is going to be a start of a new series. And what I want to talk about is just the overall problem of anxiety and OCD, right? And in this episode specifically, I want to address three important things to kind of really understand when it comes to really taking your life back from OCD. So the first thing that I want to do is just talk about the difference between fear and anxiety, right? Because I think a lot of confusion gets tossed around with these topics, and what we get caught in is this idea of trying to discern, well, is this a real threat versus is this anxiety, right? Because obviously we deal with these things very differently. So when it comes to fear, right, what we need to understand about fear is that fight or flight response is a survival mechanism that we have and has been very effective at keeping, human beings alive from the dawn of man. And the thing with fear, though, is that fear, if you were to define it, is a clear external threat that's happening right now, right? So, to revert back, like the idea of a lion coming at you right now, right? That would produce a fear response. And the fear response, right, the fight or flight response, the thing about it is it promotes a very clear action to take when there's a real current threat happening, right? It's either I fight off the threat or I flee it. Now, the thing with anxiety is our mind will produce potential or possible threats that may happen in the future or may have happened in the past, and that actually produces the same exact fight or flight response. But the problem is there's an ambiguous action to take, right? There's not a clear action to take with anxiety, so we try to become certain about something, or we ruminate, or we do all these other safety behaviors like checking, reassurance, avoidance, the list goes on and on and on. And the thing is the problem with anxiety is that it's endless, right? Because our mind can always come up with the next thing and then the next thing to be worried about. And it can just keep going and keep going and keep going and keep going. And that leads me to, really the first problem with living with OCD and anxiety and not getting help is that it's endless. Right? I mean, that's really the first issue, right? Is that it can just keep going. And as long as you're living right now, trying to control 5 minutes from now or 5 days from now or 5 weeks from now, whatever, right? You're not living now, right? And that's really the first problem with anxiety is that it because it's endless, it can just start taking over your life. And what I mean by that is taking over your present moment, right? So we spend now trying to control tomorrow, and then tomorrow trying to control the next day, and so on and so forth and so forth. And that really, when I work with someone who's really lost in anxiety, that's kind of how their life is. It's always the next thing, right? We're never really present. And what happens is as you live your life like that, you start to look back on time and realize that you weren't really engaged with things that you could have been in, right? You weren't really there in situations that you wish you were, right? And the second part is as it's endless, it also grows, right? So once we start kind of really feeding a fear, feeding a potential fear, like with something with anxiety, it grows and grows and grows. And a good example of this is in the show Better Call Saul, right? And so I was a big Breaking Bad fan when it was going on, and I've really been enjoying Better Call Saul as well. So big shout out to the creators of that show. And if you haven't seen it, I recommend it. And what's interesting in that show is it's a really good example of anxiety, right? And I think it's probably the best example of anxiety that I've ever seen displayed in a show or a movie. And you have Saul, right? And in the first season, his name's Jimmy, right? And he has this brother Chuck, and Chuck's a real high-end lawyer, right? And essentially what happens is that he starts to develop this phobia of light and electromagnetic fields, right? And so this wasn't something that he had, right? It's something that slowly developed, right? And so it started off as a certain thing, and it kind of started growing and growing and growing and growing. And then what once was I was afraid of lights in the office became I can't be around cell phones or battery watches or even any electricity in his house. And so what happens is that as his anxiety grows, he he starts to do all these other safety behaviors. So he ends up cutting off all the electricity in his house, and then he just lives with like a cooler and ice in this big old mansion, right? And he eventually can't leave his house, right? And that's really and as anxiety grows, right? So that's the second issue. The third problem is that your life becomes smaller and smaller and smaller, right? And in the show, they do a really good job of that, because what happens is he goes from being this like hotshot lawyer to essentially being agoraphobic, where he can't leave his house. Now, the thing with someone with agoraphobia is usually there's another fear that goes with that, right? There's a fear that actually is preventing them from leaving the house, right? And in this case, it was this fear of the electromagnetic fields, right? And so what happens, though, is that as he fed that fear and started doing these safety behaviors, his life became smaller and smaller and smaller, until eventually he was just trapped in his house. Now, with anxiety, the thing is the individual who's struggling with anxiety will never see the real problem, right? Because their focus is always on whatever their mind is telling them the problem is. So, and what I mean by that is, in the show Better Call Saul, Chuck, he thinks the problem is the electromagnetic fields and that he has this allergy to them, right? But the real problem is that his life became consumed by it, right? Essentially to the point where he was stuck in his house and he wasn't working and he wasn't, pursuing any kind of relationships and really just living, right? He wasn't living. He was just consumed by fear, right? Consumed by anxiety. And that really is the problem of anxiety, if I had to just summarize it, with anyone that I've ever worked with, whether it's panic attacks, OCD, general anxiety, social anxiety, phobias, even PTSD, right? I mean, if you take the kind of 6 broad categories of anxiety, that really is the problem, right? Is that your mind is telling you there's this threat, right? That's an ambiguous threat, right? It's something you can't control. And because whether it's intrusive thoughts or whether it's a fear about, flying, whatever it is, right? It's this potential threat. It's not a real threat that's happening. And because you attempt to control that, and there's an ambiguous action to take, right? And it's something that you can't control generally, it just starts to consume and consume and consume. And as the anxiety grows, your life becomes smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And that's why, when it comes to getting help with anxiety, first and foremost, we have to see the real problem of anxiety, right? And it's never what the content of our anxiety is actually saying. It's how that is making our life smaller that, in my opinion, is the real issue with anxiety. And again, I can speak into this personally with how small my life became when I was really lost in that lens of OCD and anxiety. It's just like you stop communicating with people, you stop doing things you normally would do. You don't want to go out, and as it grows and grows and grows, it just gets worse and worse and worse, right? And so if it's something that you're struggling with, it's so important to start taking action and getting help, because there are tools and help is available. It's not a way that you have to continue to live. And that's the thing that I really want to stress on this episode, is that just because you've lived like this for, however long it might have been, it doesn't have to keep going, right? Like, you can get better and you can take your life back. And that's really what recovery is about. It's about taking your life back. It's about not letting anxiety have any say over what you do with your life, right? It's about you having control. And so to quickly recap the 3 things, obviously I talked about the difference between anxiety and fear, but just the idea that anxiety is endless, right? It can keep going, right? Your mind can always come up with something else to worry about. Anxiety grows, and as anxiety grows, your life becomes smaller, right? And those are the 3 main points that I really want to talk about in this episode today. Now, if this is something you're struggling with, at Restored Minds, we have resources and assessments, that are free on our site to totally help you out and get you started on the right path. We also have our private community and online trainings to support you on your journey, as well as, other resources. So if this is something you're struggling with, I really encourage you to check out restoredminds.com. Also, we have links down below for free resources in the notes of this show. So again, we're here to support you on your journey to recovery. And I just want to say thank you so much for tuning in this week. And we look forward to continuing this series as we're going to talk about OCD and anxiety treatment and, what it's really going to take to get your life back. So again, until next time, my name's Matt, and I hope you guys have a wonderful day, and I will see you next week. Take care.